The night started like any other for rising hip-hop star Andre Thompson. Fresh off his latest album going platinum, he decided to celebrate with his small circle of friends at a new upscale bar in downtown Los Angeles. The establishment, known as the Crystal Lounge, had built quite a reputation for its exclusive atmosphere and celebrity clientele. Andre wasn't wearing his usual flashy performance attire that evening. Instead, he opted for a simple black hoodie, designer jeans, and his favorite pair of limited edition sneakers. He wanted to keep things low-key, hoping to enjoy a quiet evening without the usual fanfare that came with his growing fame. As he and his 3 friends approached the entrance, the cool California breeze carried the faint sound of jazz music from inside. The neon signs reflected off the polished windows, casting a soft blue glow on the sidewalk. Andre noticed how the other patrons entering the bar were greeted with warm smiles and quick nods from the security staff. However, when Andre's group reached the door, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. The security guard's welcoming demeanor suddenly turned cold and scrutinizing. Despite Andre's calm and polite demeanor, the guard insisted on checking their IDs multiple times, examining them under the light with unnecessary thoroughness. "Is there a problem?" Andre asked quietly, maintaining his composure despite the obvious discrimination unfolding before his eyes. His friend Michael, who worked as his producer, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. The security guard spoke into his earpiece, and moments later, a man in an expensive suit emerged from inside. He introduced himself as Richard Hammond, the bar's manager. His artificial smile didn't reach his eyes as he looked over the group. "I'm sorry, gentlemen, but we're at capacity tonight," Hammond said, despite the obvious stream of other patrons being allowed in behind him. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments down the street?" Andre's success in the music industry hadn't made him forget the sting of such encounters. He'd faced similar situations before his fame, but now, with millions of followers and platinum records to his name, he found himself dealing with the same prejudices, just in more upscale venues. One of Andre's friends pulled out their phone, ready to start recording the interaction, but Andre gently asked them to put it away. He had a different approach in mind. Years of writing lyrics about social justice and personal struggles had taught him that sometimes the most powerful responses don't need to be captured on camera. "Mr. Hammond," Andre began, his voice steady and clear, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. "I understand you might not recognize me without the stage lights and cameras, but I'm Andre Thompson. My latest album just went platinum, and I chose your establishment to celebrate that achievement." The manager's expression flickered with recognition, but he maintained his stance. Andre continued, his words measured and thoughtful, "But tonight, I'm not here as a rapper or a celebrity. I'm here as a human being, hoping to enjoy an evening with friends. The same as anyone else walking through that door." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the quiet intensity of the moment. Andre noticed phones being raised discreetly, but his focus remained on Hammond. "You see, Mr. Hammond, I could make this moment go viral. I could share this experience with my millions of followers. But instead, I'm going to offer you something more valuable, an opportunity to learn and grow." Andre reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to the stunned manager. "This is the contact information for my foundation. We conduct workshops on inclusive business practices and cultural sensitivity training. I'd like to invite you and your staff to attend one of our sessions, free of charge." The manager's face reddened, a mix of embarrassment and surprise evident in his expression. The gathering crowd had grown larger, and whispers of recognition rippled through it as more people identified the platinum-selling artist standing before them. "My success hasn't isolated me from these experiences," Andre continued, his voice carrying naturally to the captivated audience. "It's motivated me to address them differently. So tonight, instead of leaving in anger or shame, I'm extending an invitation for change." The silence that followed was profound. Even the jazz music from inside seemed to have quieted. Hammond stood frozen, the business card in his hand, as the weight of the moment settled over the scene. Several patrons who had been allowed in earlier began to walk out, some shaking their heads in disgust at the manager's behavior. Andre's friend Michael stepped forward, adding his own quiet but firm words, "The world is watching, Mr. Hammond. Not through our phones or social media, but through the conscious choices we make in moments like these. What happens next is up to you." The story of what happened that night outside the Crystal Lounge would eventually spread, not through viral videos or angry social media posts, but through word of mouth. It became a testament to how one person's dignified response to discrimination could create a ripple effect of positive change. As Andre and his friends turned to leave, several people from the crowd approached them, expressing their support and admiration for how he handled the situation. A young aspiring musician even asked for advice, not about making music, but about maintaining grace under pressure. Sometimes, Andre told the young artist, the most powerful verses we write aren't in our songs, but in our actions. Every interaction is an opportunity to either perpetuate cycles of negativity or break them. Tonight, we chose to break one. Walking away from the Crystal Lounge that evening, Andre felt a mixture of emotions. The familiar pain of discrimination was there, but it was overshadowed by a sense of purpose. He knew that his response would have a more lasting impact than any angry confrontation could have achieved. The following morning, Andre woke up to hundreds of messages from people who had witnessed the incident at the Crystal Lounge. Despite his intention to handle the situation quietly, several bystanders had shared their accounts on social media, and the story was gaining traction. What caught his attention wasn't the outrage, but the overwhelming support for how he had handled the situation. Sitting in his home studio, Andre found himself reflecting on the previous night's events. His phone buzzed with a message from his manager, Tony, who had already caught wind of what happened. "You're trending, but not for the reasons you'd expect," the message read. "People are calling you a role model for handling discrimination with such class." Andre scrolled through his social media feeds, reading countless comments from people sharing their own similar experiences. One post particularly caught his eye. A young fan had written about how Andre's response had taught them a valuable lesson about turning negative situations into opportunities for positive change. Later that morning, Andre received an unexpected call. It was Richard Hammond, the manager from the Crystal Lounge. His voice carried a different tone from the previous night, one of genuine remorse and reflection. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice slightly shaky, "I've spent the entire night thinking about what happened. I'd like to take you up on your offer for the workshop." Andre leaned back in his studio chair, a small smile forming on his face. "That's a brave first step, Mr. Hammond," he responded. "Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. When would you like to schedule it?" The conversation that followed was awkward at first but gradually evolved into something meaningful. Hammond opened up about his own biases, acknowledging that they were deeply ingrained but expressing a genuine desire to change. He shared how his staff had confronted him that morning, with several threatening to quit over his behavior. While they talked, Andre's producer Michael arrived at the studio. They had a recording session scheduled, but Andre held up a finger, signaling him to wait. This conversation was too important to cut short. Michael understood immediately, settling into the couch with his laptop to work on some beats. "Your response last night," Hammond continued, "it wasn't what I expected. I've dealt with angry customers before, but never someone who responded with such dignity. It made me look at myself in a way I haven't before." Andre thought carefully before responding. "Anger is easy, Mr. Hammond. Anyone can get angry. But creating change? That requires patience, understanding, and the willingness to see humanity in everyone, even those who deny yours." They scheduled the workshop for the following week. As Andre ended the call, Michael looked up from his laptop. "That was the manager from last night?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Andre nodded, turning to his friend with a thoughtful expression. "You know what's crazy?" Andre said, pulling up to his recording equipment. "Last night could have gone viral for all the wrong reasons. Instead, it might actually lead to something meaningful." Michael nodded, understanding the significance. "That's why your music resonates with so many people, man. You don't just talk about change, you live it." Throughout the day, more stories emerged from witnesses of the previous night's incident. A local news station reached out for an interview, but Andre politely declined. He didn't want this to become a media spectacle that might overshadow the real issue at hand. Instead, he channeled his emotions into his music. That afternoon, in his studio, he wrote what would later become one of his most impactful songs. The lyrics spoke not of anger or revenge, but of growth, understanding, and the power of responding to hate with wisdom. As evening approached, Andre received another unexpected message. It was from a group of small business owners in the area around the Crystal Lounge. They had heard about what happened and wanted to know if he would consider extending his foundation's workshop to their establishments as well. "It's not just about one incident or one place," one of the business owners wrote. "Your response made us realize we all have work to do. We want to be part of the change." Andre shared the message with his foundation's team, who immediately began working on expanding their workshop program. What had started as an unfortunate incident was transforming into a community-wide initiative for positive change. That evening, as Andre worked on his new song, he thought about how different things might have been if he'd responded with anger. The headlines would have been different, the social media response would have been different, and most importantly, the outcome would have been different. His phone buzzed again, another message from Hammond. This time, it was a formal apology letter he planned to post on the Crystal Lounge's social media accounts, along with an announcement about the upcoming workshop and their commitment to change. He wanted Andre to review it first. Reading through the letter, Andre noticed something significant. Hammond wasn't just apologizing for one incident, he was acknowledging a pattern of behavior and committing to concrete steps for change. The letter ended with an invitation for Andre and his friends to return to the lounge as honored guests, though Andre knew that wasn't the point. As he finished reading, Michael, who had been working quietly on his beats, spoke up. "You know, this whole thing reminds me of that line from your first album, 'Change doesn't come from shouting louder, but from speaking with such truth that others can't help but listen.'" Andre smiled, remembering writing those lyrics years ago, never imagining how prophetic they would become. He turned back to his recording equipment, ready to channel all of these experiences into his music. After all, that's what he did best, turn life's challenges into art that could touch hearts and change minds. The day of the workshop arrived with an unexpected level of anticipation. What had started as a single session for the Crystal Lounge had evolved into something much bigger. The local community center's main hall was filled to capacity, with business owners, staff members, and community leaders from across the city in attendance. Andre arrived early, dressed in a simple but professional dark blue suit. As he walked through the parking lot, he noticed Richard Hammond standing nervously by the entrance, adjusting his tie repeatedly. The bar manager had shown up 45 minutes early, something that spoke volumes about his commitment to change. "Good morning, Mr. Hammond," Andre called out, extending his hand. The handshake they shared was different from their first encounter. This time, it was genuine, between equals. Hammond's usual air of superiority had been replaced by something more humble, more human. Inside, Andre's foundation team had set up everything perfectly. The chairs were arranged in a circle rather than rows, creating an environment for open dialogue rather than just passive listening. On one wall, they'd posted anonymous stories of discrimination submitted by community members, each one a powerful testament to why this workshop was necessary. As people began filing in, Andre noticed something remarkable. The crowd was diverse, not just in terms of race and ethnicity, but also age, profession, and social status. There were restaurant owners, shop managers, corporate executives, and even a few local politicians. The incident at the Crystal Lounge had struck a chord that resonated throughout the community. The workshop began with Andre sharing his own story, not just about that night at the lounge, but about his journey through life and the music industry. He talked about the subtle forms of discrimination he'd faced, the ones that didn't make headlines but cut just as deep. Success doesn't shield you from prejudice, he explained, his voice carrying naturally through the room. It just changes how it's presented. But what success does give you is a platform, a chance to address these issues in a way that creates lasting change. The real breakthrough came during the group discussions. Hammond, who had been quiet initially, finally spoke up. His voice trembled slightly as he shared his own story, about growing up in a privileged bubble, inheriting not just wealth but also prejudices he'd never questioned until now. "I always thought I was one of the good ones," Hammond admitted, looking around the circle. "I hired people of all backgrounds, or so I told myself. But that night, seeing my own actions through Andre's response, it made me realize how deep these biases run." As Hammond spoke, Andre noticed several other business owners nodding in recognition. They saw themselves in his story, in his journey from denial to awareness. One by one, others began sharing their own experiences, both as perpetrators and victims of discrimination. The Foundation's facilitators guided these discussions skillfully, turning painful admissions into opportunities for growth. They introduced exercises that revealed hidden biases, presented data that challenged common prejudices, and most importantly, provided practical strategies for creating more inclusive environments. During the lunch break, Andre overheard two restaurant owners discussing changes they planned to implement in their establishments. They weren't just talking about surface-level diversity training, they were discussing structural changes to their hiring practices, customer service policies, and workplace culture. The afternoon session focused on action plans. Each participant worked on developing concrete steps they would take in their businesses. Hammond's plan for the Crystal Lounge was particularly comprehensive, from revising door policies to implementing regular staff training sessions. What impressed Andre most was how the participants began networking with each other, forming informal support groups to help maintain their commitment to change. A local business association even proposed creating a certification program for establishments that met certain standards of inclusive practices. As the workshop drew to a close, a young staff member from the Crystal Lounge approached Andre. She had been working the night of the incident and had witnessed everything. "I almost quit my job that night," she confessed. "But seeing all of this," she gestured around the room, "it gives me hope that things can actually change." Andre looked around the room one last time before leaving. The energy was different from when they'd started. People weren't just talking about change anymore, they were planning it, committing to it, ready to work for it. Outside, the sun was setting over the city skyline. Andre's producer Michael, who had attended the workshop as an observer, joined him in the parking lot. "You know what's amazing?" Michael said, "This all started because you chose not to let anger win that night." Andre nodded, thinking about how different things could have been. "Sometimes the best revenge is forcing people to confront their own humanity," he replied. "When you respond to hatred with wisdom, you don't just win the moment, you change the future." As they walked to their car, Andre's phone buzzed with a message. It was from his record label. The song he'd written after the incident at the Crystal Lounge, the one born from that experience, they wanted to make it the lead single for his next album. Perfect timing, Andre smiled, showing Michael the message. "Music has always been my way of turning pain into purpose. Now this song can be part of something bigger than just my story." The drive home that evening felt different. The city streets seemed to hold new possibility. In just a few weeks, what had started as an ugly incident of discrimination had transformed into a catalyst for community-wide change. Andre knew there was still much work to be done, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like real progress was possible. 2 weeks after the workshop, Andre sat in his recording studio, putting the finishing touches on his new single, Change the Narrative. The song, inspired by the incident at the Crystal Lounge, had evolved into something far more powerful than he'd initially imagined. The studio walls vibrated with the bass line as he listened to the final mix, each word carrying the weight of lived experience. His phone lit up with a text from Tony, his manager. Local news outlets were reporting a surge of businesses signing up for similar workshops. The ripple effect was real, and it was growing. But what caught Andre's attention was the second part of the message: the Crystal Lounge was hosting a community forum that evening. "You should go," Michael suggested, looking up from his mixing board. Not as the star who was discriminated against, but as a member of the community. Andre nodded, knowing his friend was right. This wasn't about him anymore, it was about supporting a movement for change. The Crystal Lounge looked different that evening. Gone was the exclusive atmosphere that had once defined it. Instead, the space had been transformed into a welcoming venue for community dialogue. The usual jazz band was there, but they were playing softer melodies that encouraged conversation rather than drowning it out. As Andre walked in, he noticed the diversity of the crowd. There were faces from the workshop, local residents, business owners, and even some of his fans who'd heard about the event. Hammond greeted him at the door, not with the artificial smile of their first encounter, but with genuine warmth. "We've made some changes," Hammond said, gesturing around the room. The staff now reflected the diversity of the city, and new artwork from local artists of color adorned the walls. But more than the visible changes, there was a different energy in the air, one of openness and inclusion. The community forum began with several speakers sharing their experiences with discrimination in local businesses. Andre sat quietly in the back, listening as people opened up about their stories. Some were painful to hear, others hopeful, but all were part of the larger narrative of a community working to heal and grow. A young bartender from another local establishment stood up to speak. "After what happened here, we started having conversations at our place too," she shared. "It's like someone finally gave us permission to talk about these things openly. We're not perfect, but we're trying to do better." Hammond took the stage next, his hands slightly shaking as he held his notes. "A few weeks ago, I was the problem," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I thought I was protecting my business, but I was really just protecting my own prejudices. It took someone showing me unexpected grace to make me see that." As Hammond spoke, Andre noticed several people filming on their phones. This time, though, it wasn't to capture controversy, it was to document progress. The story of the Crystal Lounge was becoming a different kind of viral, a template for how businesses could transform their culture. During a break in the forum, Andre found himself in conversation with a group of young entrepreneurs. They were planning to open a new restaurant and wanted advice on how to build an inclusive culture from the ground up. "It's not just about avoiding discrimination," Andre told them. "It's about actively creating spaces where everyone feels valued." The evening took an unexpected turn when the jazz band invited Andre to join them for a song. He hadn't planned to perform, but something about the moment felt right. As he took the stage, he didn't launch into one of his hits. Instead, he gave them a raw, acoustic version of "Change the Narrative." The lyrics hit differently in that space, with that audience. Each word carried the weight of the past few weeks' experiences, but also the hope of what was to come. The crowd fell silent, absorbing every line, every truth laid bare in the verses. After his performance, an elderly gentleman approached him. He introduced himself as Mr. Chen, the owner of a small grocery store in the neighborhood. "I've been in business here for 40 years, he said, his eyes bright with emotion. "I've seen many things change, but this feels different. This feels real." As the forum continued, Andre noticed Richard Hammond's daughter had joined the crowd. She was a college student studying social justice, and the pride in her eyes as she watched her father lead discussions about inclusion was unmistakable. "Dad's different now," she told Andre during a quiet moment. What happened that night, it didn't just change his business, it changed our whole family. The local news crew that had been covering the event asked Andre for a comment. He politely declined an on-camera interview but offered them something else instead, an invitation to document the ongoing transformation of businesses throughout the community. This isn't about one night or one place anymore, he explained. It's about showing people what's possible when we choose growth over conflict. As the evening drew to a close, Hammond approached Andre with an unexpected proposal. He wanted to turn the Crystal Lounge's monthly jazz nights into a platform for diverse artists from the community. Music brought us together, Hammond said. Maybe it can help us stay together. On his way out, Andre paused to look at a new piece of art hanging near the entrance, a mural depicting hands of different colors intertwined. Below it was a plaque with words that made him smile, "Growth begins where judgment ends." Back in his car, Andre received another text from Tony. Change the Narrative had been leaked online, and social media was already buzzing. But unlike most leaked tracks that sparked outrage from artists and labels, this one felt different. The timing was perfect. The song was finding its audience just as its message was needed most. Sometimes, Andre thought as he drove home, the universe has its own plan. The incident that could have been just another viral moment of outrage had instead become a catalyst for real change. And somewhere in that transformation, everyone involved had found a piece of their better selves. The release of Change the Narrative marked a turning point in Andre's career. The song, which had started as a personal response to that night at the Crystal Lounge, resonated with listeners in ways he hadn't anticipated. Radio stations were playing it without any promotional push, and social media was filled with people sharing their own stories of transformation. One morning, as Andre scrolled through his messages, he found an email from a high school teacher in Detroit. She had used his song to start conversations about inclusion in her classroom, and the results had been remarkable. Her students had begun organizing their own workshops, addressing issues of discrimination within their school community. Your song gave them a blueprint, the teacher wrote. It showed them that responding to hate with wisdom isn't weakness, it's strength. Attached to the email were letters from her students, each one sharing how the story behind the song had impacted them. Andre forwarded the email to his foundation team. This is bigger than we thought, he wrote in his message. We need to develop a program specifically for schools. His team jumped into action, beginning work on a curriculum that would help young people navigate similar situations. Meanwhile, the Crystal Lounge had become something of a case study in business transformation. Richard Hammond found himself being invited to speak at business associations and Chamber of Commerce meetings across the city. His honest accounts of his own journey from prejudice to awareness were powerful, particularly because he didn't shy away from acknowledging his past mistakes. The hardest part, Hammond admitted during one such meeting, wasn't changing our policies. It was changing our mindset. We had to learn that diversity isn't just about who you let through the door, it's about who feels welcome to stay. The local business community was taking notice. Other establishments began reaching out to Andre's foundation, not just for workshops, but for long-term guidance on creating inclusive spaces. A group of restaurant owners even formed a coalition, developing shared standards for inclusive practices and holding each other accountable. One evening, while Andre was working in his studio, he received an unexpected visitor. It was Lisa, the young bartender who had almost quit the Crystal Lounge after the incident. She had started a program to mentor other service industry workers dealing with discrimination in their workplaces. Your response that night changed how I view conflict, she explained, sharing her plans to expand the mentorship program. I realized we don't have to choose between standing up for ourselves and creating change. Sometimes, the most powerful stance is showing others a better way. Andre listened as Lisa described how the mentorship program was already making a difference. Service industry workers were finding their voice, learning to address discrimination constructively rather than suffering in silence. They were also supporting each other, creating a network of allies across different establishments. The story continued to evolve in unexpected ways. A documentary filmmaker approached Andre about creating a short film about the transformation of the Crystal Lounge and its impact on the community. The filmmaker wasn't interested in sensationalizing the initial incident, she wanted to focus on the journey of change that followed. There are plenty of viral videos showing discrimination, the filmmaker explained during their meeting. But we rarely see what happens after, the hard work of transformation, the uncomfortable conversations, the small victories that add up to real change. Andre agreed to participate, but with one condition: the documentary needed to focus on the community's response rather than just his role in it. He wanted to highlight the business owners who had embraced change, the employees who had become advocates, and the customers who had supported the transformation. During the filming, they captured a powerful moment at the Crystal Lounge. A group of regular customers, who had been coming to the bar for years, sat down with new patrons from different backgrounds. They shared stories, laughed together, and found common ground over drinks and jazz music. The scene reminded Andre of something his grandfather used to say: real change doesn't happen in the spotlight, it happens in the small moments when people choose to see each other as human beings. The documentary also followed Hammond as he visited other businesses in the community, sharing his experiences and learning from others. His daughter joined him for some of these visits, and their conversations about privilege, responsibility, and growth became a central part of the film. "I used to think my father was set in his ways," his daughter shared during one interview. "Now I'm watching him become a leader in creating the kind of change I've been studying in college. It's shown me that it's never too late to learn and grow." As filming progressed, Andre's foundation received an invitation from a national business association. They wanted to develop a certification program for inclusive business practices, using the transformation of the Crystal Lounge as a model. The program would provide businesses with concrete steps for creating inclusive environments, along with regular assessments and support. "What happened at the Crystal Lounge shouldn't be the exception," Andre said during a planning meeting for the certification program. "It should be the beginning of a new standard for how businesses operate." The impact continued to ripple outward. Other artists began reaching out to Andre, wanting to collaborate on songs about social change. But rather than just writing lyrics about discrimination, they wanted to create music that offered solutions, that showed paths forward, that inspired hope. Throughout all of this, Andre kept returning to his studio, working on new music that reflected these experiences. Change the Narrative had opened a door, but he knew there were more stories to tell, more conversations to start, more changes to inspire. One evening, as he was leaving the studio, he ran into a young fan who recognized him from the documentary footage that had been released online. The fan wasn't interested in taking a selfie or getting an autograph. Instead, he wanted to share how the story had helped him handle a similar situation at his job. "You showed me that we have a choice in how we respond to discrimination," the fan said. "And sometimes, the choices that seem the hardest in the moment are the ones that create the most lasting change." 6 months after the incident at the Crystal Lounge, Andre found himself back in the studio, but this time he wasn't alone. The space was filled with young musicians from across the city, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives to a collaborative album project inspired by the movement for change that had grown from that fateful night. The project, titled Community Voices, had started as a simple idea, gathering local artists to share their stories through music. But it had evolved into something much more significant. Artists who might never have crossed paths before were now working together, breaking down barriers that had long divided the local music scene. "It's like the walls between genres are coming down," observed DJ Ray, a veteran of the local hip-hop scene who had joined the project. "We're not just mixing music styles anymore, we're mixing experiences, perspectives, cultures." The Crystal Lounge had become their unofficial meeting spot after recording sessions. The very place that had once symbolized exclusion now served as a hub for creative collaboration. Hammond had transformed the venue's weekly jazz nights into showcase events featuring diverse local talents, and the energy was infectious. One evening, during a break in recording, Andre received a call from a civil rights organization in Chicago. They had been following the changes happening in the community and wanted to create a nationwide program based on the model that had emerged. "Your approach is different," the organization's director explained. "It's not about shame or punishment, it's about transformation." The timing of the call was perfect. Andre had been thinking about how to scale the impact of what they'd achieved. The documentary about the Crystal Lounge's transformation was in its final editing stages, and early screenings had generated significant interest from business leaders and community organizers across the country. "We need to show people that this isn't just a local story," Andre told his foundation team during their next meeting. "The principles we've discovered here can work anywhere." They began working on a comprehensive guide that would help other communities replicate their success. The guide wasn't just about handling incidents of discrimination, it was about creating environments where such incidents became less likely to occur. It included practical steps for businesses, real-world examples of successful changes, and strategies for building community support. Hammond had become an unexpected ally in this effort. His candid accounts of his own transformation helped other business owners let down their defenses and engage with the process of change. "If I could move past my prejudices," he often said, "anyone can. It's just about being willing to take that first step." The impact was especially visible in the younger generation. Local high schools had started incorporating lessons from the community's experience into their curriculum. Students were learning about conflict resolution, cultural awareness, and the power of responding to negativity with wisdom rather than anger. Andre visited one of these classes, expecting to speak about his experience. Instead, he found himself learning from the students. They had taken the basic principles from his story and developed their own innovative approaches to addressing discrimination in their school environment. "What you did that night wasn't just about handling one situation," a student told him during the class discussion. "You showed us that how we respond to discrimination can either end the conversation or start a new one. We're choosing to start new conversations." The collaborative album project was nearing completion when something unexpected happened. A major music festival announced they were adding a new stage dedicated to promoting artists who were using their platform for social change. Change the Narrative had been selected as the inspiration for this initiative. During one of the recording sessions, Andre sat back and watched as artists from different backgrounds worked together, building on each other's ideas, creating something new and powerful. The music they were making wasn't just about protest or pain, it was about possibility, about the world they wanted to create. A young singer-songwriter named Kai, who had been quietly observing the session, finally spoke up. "You know what's different about this project," she said, her voice soft but clear. "We're not just telling stories about what's wrong. We're creating anthems for what could be right." The documentary premiered at a local theater, with the community turning out in full force to support it. The screening was followed by a panel discussion where business owners, community leaders, and artists shared their perspectives on the changes they'd witnessed and helped create. During the discussion, Lisa, the bartender-turned-mentor, shared how the mentorship program had expanded to include training for management teams. "We're not just supporting workers who face discrimination," she explained. "We're helping create environments where discrimination becomes unthinkable." The event ended with an impromptu performance. Artists from the collaborative album project took the stage, joining Andre in a live rendition of "Change the Narrative." The song had evolved, incorporating new verses that reflected the community's journey over the past 6 months. As they performed, Andre looked out at the audience. He saw Hammond and his daughter sitting next to Mr. Chen from the grocery store. He saw young activists chatting with business owners. He saw people who might never have shared the same space 6 months ago, now united in their commitment to positive change. After the screening, a group of community leaders approached Andre with a proposal. They wanted to establish a regular forum where business owners, artists, activists, and community members could come together to continue the work they'd started. The Crystal Lounge had offered to host these meetings. What happened that night could have ended with anger and division, one of the leaders said. Instead, it became a catalyst for unity and growth. We need to keep that momentum going. As Andre drove home that night, he thought about how a single moment of choice had led to all of this. His decision to respond to discrimination with wisdom rather than anger hadn't just changed one situation, it had started a movement that was still growing, still evolving, still creating positive change in unexpected ways. 1 year after the incident at the Crystal Lounge, Andre stood on stage at a national conference focused on business ethics and community transformation. The audience was filled with business leaders, community organizers, and activists from across the country, all eager to learn from what had become known as the Crystal Lounge effect. As he shared the story once again, Andre noticed how differently it felt now. What had started as a personal experience of discrimination had evolved into a blueprint for community change. The conference organizers had specifically requested that he focus on the aftermath, the year of transformation that had followed that pivotal night. The easy part is getting angry, Andre told the audience. The challenging part is channeling that anger into something constructive. That's where real change begins. He went on to describe how the initial workshop at the Crystal Lounge had sparked a movement that none of them had anticipated. The conference featured a special panel discussion where Richard Hammond joined Andre on stage. Their unlikely partnership had become a powerful symbol of what was possible when people chose growth over conflict. Hammond's vulnerability in sharing his journey had inspired other business owners to confront their own biases. "A year ago, I was the problem," Hammond admitted to the packed auditorium. "Today, I'm part of the solution. But the real victory isn't in my personal transformation, it's in what our community achieved together." He went on to share how the Crystal Lounge's inclusive business model had actually improved their bottom line. During the lunch break, Andre met with a group of young entrepreneurs who were launching a startup incubator focused on supporting minority-owned businesses. They had incorporated lessons from the Crystal Lounge story into their program design, creating mentorship opportunities that bridged cultural and economic divides. "Your story showed us that change doesn't have to be confrontational," one of the entrepreneurs explained. "Sometimes, the most effective approach is to create new pathways for understanding and growth." The collaborative album, Community Voices, had been released 2 months earlier, and its impact was still rippling through the music industry. What made it unique wasn't just its message of unity, it was how that message had been created, with artists from different backgrounds coming together to share their stories and perspectives. Back home, the Crystal Lounge had become a model for business transformation. The monthly community forums they hosted had grown into a regional network of businesses committed to creating inclusive spaces. What started as a response to discrimination had evolved into a proactive movement for positive change. Lisa's mentorship program for service industry workers had expanded to 3 other cities. She had developed a comprehensive training curriculum that helped workers and management teams address discrimination effectively while promoting inclusive practices. The key was realizing that we're not just fighting against something, Lisa shared during a breakout session at the conference. We're building something new. That shifts the entire dynamic from confrontation to collaboration. The documentary about the Crystal Lounge's transformation had been picked up by a major streaming service, reaching audiences far beyond their local community. But what made Andre proudest wasn't the film's success, it was how communities were using it as a teaching tool, sparking their own conversations about change. During the conference, Andre received news that particularly moved him. A group of high school students who had been inspired by his story had created their own peer mediation program. They were teaching other young people how to address conflicts and discrimination with wisdom rather than escalation. "Your song changed the narrative, gave us the words," one student wrote in a letter shared at the conference. "But your actions showed us the way. We're learning that how we respond to negativity shapes not just that moment, but everything that follows. The certification program for inclusive business practices, developed in partnership with the National Business Association, was now being implemented in cities across the country. It provided a clear framework for businesses to assess their practices and make meaningful changes. What makes this program different, explained the association's director during a presentation, is that it's not just about checking boxes. It's about creating a culture of continuous growth and learning. Andre's foundation had grown significantly over the year, but they had been careful to maintain their focus on creating lasting change rather than just responding to incidents. They had developed specialized programs for different sectors: education, business, entertainment, each building on the lessons learned from the Crystal Lounge experience. The conference also featured a technology component, where developers showcased apps and platforms designed to support inclusive business practices. One app, inspired by the community's journey, helped businesses track their progress in implementing inclusive policies while connecting them with resources and support networks. During an evening reception, Andre found himself in conversation with a city council member from another state. She had implemented a program in her city based on the Crystal Lounge model, adapting it to address specific challenges in her community. What's remarkable, she noted, is how this approach brings people together instead of driving them apart. We're seeing businesses that used to compete now collaborating on community initiatives. The Change the Narrative movement had also influenced how other artists approached social issues in their work. Instead of just highlighting problems, more creators were focusing on solutions, using their platforms to showcase positive transformation and community building. As the conference drew to a close, Andre participated in a final panel discussion about the future of inclusive business practices. The conversation wasn't just about preventing discrimination, it was about creating environments where every person's dignity and potential were recognized and valued. A year ago, I stood outside the Crystal Lounge facing discrimination, Andre reflected during the closing session. Today, I'm standing here witnessing how one moment of choice can spark a movement for change. But the real heroes of this story are in communities across the country, doing the daily work of transformation. That evening, after the conference, Andre received a video call from his grandfather. The elderly man had been following the development of the movement and had something important to share. "You know," his grandfather said, his voice filled with emotion, "when I was young, we fought against discrimination with protests and boycotts. Those were necessary battles. But what you've done, showing people a path to change through wisdom and understanding, that's a different kind of revolution. Sometimes the quietest revolutions create the most lasting change." 18 months after the incident at the Crystal Lounge, Andre returned to the venue for a special anniversary event. The place had changed so much that it barely resembled the exclusive establishment where he'd once faced discrimination. Tonight, it was filled with people from all walks of life, united in celebrating the journey they'd shared. The evening began with a community dinner, where tables were intentionally mixed to bring together people who might never have connected otherwise. Business owners sat with activists, artists shared meals with city officials, and young entrepreneurs exchanged ideas with established community leaders. Andre found himself seated next to a young woman who introduced herself as Jenny, a business student doing her thesis on what she called the Crystal Lounge model of community transformation. She had been tracking how the movement had influenced business practices across the country. "What fascinates me," Jenny explained, "is how this went beyond just changing policies. It changed how people think about business success. Inclusion isn't just a moral imperative anymore, it's recognized as good business practice." The walls of the Crystal Lounge now displayed a rotating gallery of local artists' work, each piece telling a story of community and transformation. Richard Hammond, who had once been the face of exclusion, now stood proudly among the diverse crowd, greeting everyone with genuine warmth. "Sometimes I look around and can hardly believe this is the same place," Hammond confided to Andre during a quiet moment. "But then I realize it's not the same place, and I'm not the same person. That's what real change looks like." The success of the Inclusive Business Certification program had exceeded all expectations. Over 500 businesses across the country had completed the certification, with thousands more in the process. But more important than the numbers were the stories of transformation coming from each participating establishment. During the evening, Lisa took the stage to share updates about the mentorship program she had started. It had evolved into a national network of support for service industry workers, with chapters in 20 cities. "We're not just preventing discrimination," she announced. "We're creating a new standard for how the service industry operates." The collaborative album, Community Voices, had sparked a trend in the music industry. Record labels were actively seeking projects that brought together diverse artists to create music with a purpose. Andre's own label had established a division specifically focused on supporting such collaborations. "Music has always been a bridge between communities," Andre reflected during his address to the gathering. "But now we're intentionally using that bridge to create lasting connections and real change." The documentary about the Crystal Lounge's transformation had become required viewing in business schools across the country. Its success had led to a series of short films highlighting similar transformations in other communities, each adding new perspectives to the ongoing conversation about inclusive business practices. The high school students who had been inspired by the movement were now preparing to graduate, but their impact would continue. The peer mediation program they had created was being adopted by schools nationwide, teaching a new generation how to address conflict with wisdom and understanding. "You showed us that change doesn't have to be angry to be powerful," one of the student leaders told Andre. "That lesson will stay with us long after we leave school." The technology developed to support inclusive business practices had evolved into a comprehensive platform. The app now included features for community feedback, resource sharing, and collaboration between businesses committed to maintaining inclusive environments. During the evening, Andre premiered a new song he had written specifically for the anniversary. Unlike "Change the Narrative," which had captured the initial moment of transformation, this song celebrated the ongoing journey of community growth and unity. The lyrics spoke of small victories and daily choices, of bridges built and barriers broken, of communities transformed not through confrontation but through connection. The chorus, sung by a choir of local voices, emphasized the power of choosing wisdom over anger, growth over conflict. As the song ended, Hammond's daughter, now working as a diversity consultant for major corporations, shared how the movement had influenced her career choice. "What happened here showed me that real change is possible," she said. "It gave me hope for the future of business and community relations." The National Business Association announced during the event that they were establishing a scholarship program inspired by the Crystal Lounge story. The scholarships would support young entrepreneurs committed to creating inclusive business models in underserved communities. Mr. Chen, the grocery store owner who had attended the first community forum, stood up to share his perspective. "In 40 years of business, I never thought I would see such change," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This movement showed us that it's never too late to create a better way of doing business." The evening included a special ceremony recognizing businesses that had gone above and beyond in creating inclusive environments. The awards weren't just for following guidelines, they celebrated innovation in community engagement and creative approaches to fostering inclusion. Andre's foundation had grown into a respected resource for communities seeking to implement similar transformations. They had developed specialized programs for different sectors, each building on the core principles that had emerged from the Crystal Lounge experience. "The key," Andre explained during the ceremony, "is understanding that transformation isn't a destination, it's a journey. Each community finds its own path, but the principles remain the same: wisdom over anger, growth over conflict, unity over division." As the evening drew to a close, the jazz band that had been part of the Crystal Lounge's history began to play. The music filled the room as people from different backgrounds, who might never have shared this space 18 months ago, danced together, talked together, celebrated together. Looking around the room, Andre thought about that night 18 months ago when he stood outside these doors facing discrimination. The anger he had felt then could have led to a viral moment of outrage, a brief flash of public attention before fading away. Instead, his choice to respond with wisdom had sparked something far more powerful, a sustained movement for positive change that continued to grow and evolve. The Crystal Lounge was no longer just a bar, it had become a symbol of what was possible when communities chose transformation over conflict. As Andre prepared to leave, a young boy approached him with a question that captured the essence of everything they had achieved. When you were standing outside that night, did you know all of this would happen? Andre smiled, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. No, he replied honestly. I just knew that how we respond to negativity shapes not just that moment, but every moment that follows. Sometimes the smallest choices create the biggest changes. The Crystal Lounge's transformation had shown that change was possible, not through dramatic confrontations or viral moments, but through the patient, persistent work of people committed to creating something better. It was a lesson that would continue to inspire communities for generations to come.